The Moment of Truth, based on The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, 1884. The Mississippi stretched before me like a great brown snake, its muddy waters carrying secrets and sorrows downstream. I sat there on that makeshift raft, the weight of the world pressing down on my 13-year-old shoulders, heavier than the humid Missouri air that clung to my skin like guilt itself. Jim was sleeping nearby, his gentle snoring mixing with the lapping of water against our crude vessel. In the moonlight, his weathered face looked peaceful, almost childlike, and it struck me how different he seemed from all the things I'd been taught about his kind. Here was a man who'd shown me nothing but kindness, who'd protected me through storms, both literal and figurative, who'd become more of a father to me than Pap ever was. But the letter in my pocket felt like it was burning a hole clear through to my heart. I'd written it to Miss Watson, telling her exactly where she could find her property. The words came easy enough. I'd been raised to believe it was my Christian duty, my moral obligation to society. Every Sunday school lesson, every sermon, every adult who'd ever claimed to know right from wrong had drummed it into my head. Stealing was a sin, and helping a slave escape was stealing, plain and simple. I pulled out that crumpled piece of paper and stared at the words I'd scratched across it in my careful, unpracticed handwriting. The ink looked black as sin in the moonlight, and I could almost hear the preacher's voice thundering about hellfire and damnation for those who went against God's natural order. My hands trembled as I held that letter. All I had to do was find someone heading toward shore, hand it over, and my conscience would be clear. I'd be right with the Lord, right with society, right with everything I'd been taught was decent and proper. The alternative, well, the alternative was eternal damnation, wasn't it? That's what they'd all told me. But then Jim stirred in his sleep and murmured something about his family. His voice was soft, full of longing for his wife and children back home. He told me about them during our long nights on the river, how his little daughter had been deaf and he hadn't known it, how guilty he felt for scolding her before he understood. He talked about his wife's laugh, about teaching his boy to fish, about dreams of buying their freedom someday. How could someone who loved so deeply, who felt so much pain and joy and hope, be considered property? How could the same society that claimed to worship a God of love and compassion turn its back on such obvious humanity? I thought about all the times Jim had looked out for me. When I was sick with fever, he'd sat up all night applying cool cloths to my forehead. When I played that cruel trick on him after we got separated in the fog, the hurt in his eyes taught me more about decency than any sermon ever had. When I was scared or lonely, his steady presence reminded me I wasn't alone in this vast, confusing world. The river whispered its ancient secrets as I sat there wrestling with my soul. Everything I'd been taught said one thing, but everything I'd experienced with Jim said another. Could all those righteous folks really be right, if being right meant betraying the best friend I'd ever had? My heart pounded as I made my choice. With shaking hands, I tore that letter into tiny pieces and watched them flutter away on the night breeze like confetti at a funeral, the funeral of my old way of thinking. "All right then," I whispered to the darkness, "I'll go to hell." But even as I said those words, the weight on my chest began to lift. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe freely. Maybe I was damning my soul, but I was saving something else, something that felt more precious than any promise of heavenly reward. The river carried us forward into the unknown, and I was ready to face whatever came next. But what dangers awaited us downstream? Would my choice save Jim or doom us both? Find out what happens next in Mark Twain's masterpiece, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about friendship, courage, and doing what's right.